Welcome to Bedtime Express, your journey into peaceful sleep through the stories of history. Tonight, we invite you to drift away as we tell the remarkable story of D-Day, June 6th, 1944. The greatest amphibious landing in human history. Before you fall asleep, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Bedtime Express for more bedtime stories that help you drift into peaceful sleep, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Over the next hours, you will hear the tale of courage and sacrifice, of ordinary men who accomplished extraordinary things on the beaches of Normandy. From the paratroopers who fell from the sky like angels, to the soldiers who waded through the surf toward freedom, this is their story. Now, settle into your pillows, adjust your blankets, and let your eyes gently close. Take a deep breath in and slowly release. Let the cares of the day fade away as we travel back in time together. Relax, get comfortable, and let the story carry you softly into dreams. Our journey begins now. D-Day Normandy Landings, the greatest landing in history. Close your eyes now, dear listener, and let your mind drift back through the mists of time, back to a world wrapped in the shadows of war, where the future of humanity hung in the balance like morning dew on a spider's web. It was the spring of 1944, and across the English Channel, the green fields of southern England hummed with a quiet, urgent energy. In countless camps, airfields, and harbors, men from many nations were gathering like migrating birds, preparing for an impossible journey. Americans with their easy smiles and chewing gum, Canadians steady as the northern pines, British soldiers carrying centuries of island resolve, and brave souls from occupied nations dreaming of home. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man from Kansas who had never expected to hold the fate of the world in his weathered hands, walked the halls of Southwick House on these restless spring nights. The weight of Operation Overlord pressed upon his shoulders like a heavy blanket, warming and suffocating at once. He knew that in the coming weeks, he would give an order that would send over 150,000 young men across a narrow strip of water that might as well have been an ocean. Across that channel, along the Norman coast that had known Roman legions and Viking longships, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel surveyed his Atlantic wall. Miles of concrete and steel, millions of mines buried in the sand like deadly seeds, obstacles rising from the beaches like the ribs of some ancient beast. He had fought in the deserts of Africa under blazing suns, but here, on these quiet beaches, he faced his greatest challenge yet. The planners had worked through countless nights, their minds dancing between 1,000 variables. Tide tables became prayers, weather reports became prophecy. They studied aerial photographs until the Norman beaches were etched into their dreams, memorizing every seawall, every bunker, every grain of sand that might shelter a German machine gun. The invasion must come with the dawn, when the tide was right, when the moon smiled down upon the brave, when the wind carried their hopes rather than their fears. In the great ports of southern England, ships gathered like a vast flock of mechanical seabirds. Liberty ships rode heavy in the water, their holds pregnant with ammunition, food, fuel, and all the dreams of freedom. Destroyers cut elegant lines through the harbor waters, their crews young men who had learned seamanship on lakes and rivers, now tasked with escorting the greatest armada in human history. Landing craft by the thousands bobbed at anchor, humble vessels that would carry democracy itself across the waters. The airfields too hummed with preparation, like beehives in summer. Pilots walked among their planes in the soft evening light, running hands along wing edges, checking instruments one last time. These flying fortresses and nimble fighters would carry the hopes of the world on aluminum wings, their cruise boys from Iowa and Alabama, from Yorkshire and Ontario, united in purpose across the vast sky. But perhaps most remarkable were the men themselves, these ordinary boys turned soldiers by the accident of history. In the camps, they wrote letters home by flickering candlelight, telling mothers and sweethearts about the English countryside, about the kindness of strangers, about everything except the great secret that weighed upon their hearts. Some played cards, others cleaned weapons that gleamed like prayers in the lamplight. Many simply lay on their narrow cots and stared at the canvas above, thinking of home, of faces they might never see again, of the great unknown that waited beyond tomorrow's horizon. The paratroopers felt it most acutely, these men who would leap from perfectly good airplanes into the darkness of occupied France. They packed their parachutes with the care of priests preparing communion, each fold a meditation on courage, each strap a lifeline to the world of the living. Their faces were painted with camouflage that made them look like young gods of war, but their eyes held all the vulnerability of boys far from home. In the French countryside, the resistance waited with the patience of hunters. In farmhouse kitchens and basement hideouts, men and women who had lived for 4 years under the boot of occupation prepared for the moment when the tide might finally turn. They sharpened knives and oiled pistols, but more importantly, they sharpened their hope, keeping it bright and keen for the day when it might finally cut through the darkness. The French citizens of Normandy, sleeping in their beds that spring, had no idea that their peaceful corner of the world would soon become the most famous battlefield in human history. Farmers dreamed of harvest, fishermen of calm seas and full nets, children of summer holidays and bicycle rides through apple orchards. The ancient stones of Norman churches, which had witnessed conquests and crusades, prepared to witness one more chapter in the endless human story of courage and sacrifice. Weather reports became matters of life and death during these waiting weeks. Royal Air Force meteorologists studied Atlantic pressure systems with the intensity of ancient priests reading omens in bird flight. High pressure meant clear skies but dangerous storms. Low pressure meant clouds but calmer seas. The perfect balance seemed as elusive as a dream, yet upon it hung the fate of the free world. As May turned to June, the tension in southern England became almost visible, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Training exercises grew more intense, more realistic, more urgent. Men who had practiced amphibious landings a dozen times practiced them once more, knowing that the next time would be no rehearsal. Equipment was checked and double-checked, ammunition counted and recounted, prayers whispered and re-whispered into the gathering dusk. The deception plans, elaborate as stage magic, reached their crescendo during these final weeks. False radio traffic filled the airwaves. Phantom armies gathered in southeastern England. Dummy equipment gleamed under the spring Sunday. The Germans must believe the invasion would come at Calais, across the narrowest part of the Channel, where logic said it should come. But logic, the planners knew, was sometimes the enemy of surprise, and surprise might be the difference between liberation and catastrophe. In his tent, an American soldier from Minnesota read a letter from his mother for the 100th time, the paper soft as silk from handling. She wrote of spring planting, of the dog that missed him, of neighbors who asked after him every Sunday after church. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his breast pocket, next to his heart, where it would travel with him across the Channel and into history. A British officer studied maps by lamplight, memorizing every curve of the Norman coast, every road that led inland from the beaches. His finger traced the routes again and again, like a monk illuminating manuscripts, until the geography became part of his soul. He knew that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, he would walk these roads not as lines on paper, but as muddy paths under enemy fire. Canadian engineers worked through the night, waterproofing vehicles that would wade through surf and sand, sealing engines against salt spray and enemy bullets. Their hands were black with grease and blessed with purpose, for they knew that every bolt properly tightened, every seal perfectly placed, might save a life when dawn broke over Normandy. The great deception continued even in these final hours. Radio operators sent false messages about invasion preparations in southeastern England, their Morse code tapping out lies that might save thousands of lives. Dummy landing craft bobbed in Dover Harbor, while the real armada gathered further west, hidden in Devon and Cornwall harbors like a secret kept by the sea itself. And through it all, the ordinary rhythm of English life continued like a heartbeat. Pub keepers served pints to soldiers who might not see another sunset. Shopkeepers sold cigarettes and chocolate to boys who dreamed of home. Farmers worked fields that would soon be left to grow wild as every able-bodied man crossed the channel to write history in sand and blood. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a Europe groaning under oppression, of slave laborers building Atlantic Wall fortifications, of resistance fighters sabotaging railway lines, of ordinary people holding on to hope like drowning sailors clutching driftwood. Every piece of information, every photograph, every intercepted message was a voice crying out from the darkness, "Come quickly, come quietly, but come." As the nights grew shorter and the days longer, as spring edged towards summer, the waiting became almost unbearable. Men cleaned their rifles and wrote in diaries, played cards and said prayers, all the while feeling history pressing against them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. They were ordinary men about to attempt something extraordinary. Farm boys and factory workers preparing to storm the most heavily defended coastline in the world. The transport aircraft sat on airfields across southern England like sleeping giants, their bellies ready to carry paratroopers into the darkness above Normandy. Pilots ran through their checklists one more time. Navigators studied maps until their eyes burned. Crew chiefs checked engines that would carry democracy on aluminum wings through the dangerous sky. In London, Churchill paced the war rooms, cigar smoke wreathing his head like incense, the weight of empire and alliance heavy on his broad shoulders. He had promised the world a second front, had spoken of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and now the moment approached when words must become deeds, when rhetoric must transform into reality. The medical corps prepared for the wounded who would surely come, setting up field hospitals and aid stations, training medics who would carry no weapons but would face the same dangers as any soldier. They packed bandages and morphine, scalpels and prayers, knowing that healing hands would be as crucial as fighting hands in the battles to come. And somewhere in occupied France, a young woman looked out her bedroom window at the same stars that shone over England and whispered a prayer for liberation, not knowing that across the channel 150,000 young men were preparing to answer that prayer with their lives. The gathering storm was almost ready to break. Soon, very soon, the greatest armada in history would set sail across dark waters toward a dawn that would change the world forever. The men were ready, the ships were ready, the planes were ready. Only the weather remained uncertain, like fate itself, holding its breath for the moment when history would pivot on the narrow blade of courage. The wind whispered secrets across the English countryside on the night of June 3rd, 1944. In rooms lit by single lamps and minds heavy with responsibility, the commanders of the Allied forces faced the moment that would define a generation. The weather reports crackled over radio sets, like prophecies from ancient oracles, speaking of storms and clearings, of tides and timing, of windows of opportunity that opened and closed like the eyes of sleeping gods. General Eisenhower sat in the quiet of Southwick House, Portsmouth, his Kansas farm boy's hands spread flat on the table before him, as if he could draw strength from the wood itself. Outside, the June rain drummed against windows like impatient fingers, and the wind carried the salt taste of the Channel and the weight of history. Around that table sat the finest military minds of the Allied nations, men who had studied war as others studied poetry, but none had ever faced a decision quite like this. The meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, spoke in the measured tones of a man who knew that his words might save or doom thousands of souls. The storm system moving across the Atlantic was fierce and unforgiving, but behind it, tucked like a gift in its wake, lay a brief window of opportunity. June 5th would bring terrible weather, winds that would turn landing craft into toys and paratroopers into scattered leaves. But June 6th might offer a fragile chance. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock, its pendulum marking off the seconds until history would demand an answer. The invasion had already been postponed once, from June 5th to June 6th, and another delay would mean waiting weeks for the tides to align again. Weeks during which the secret might be discovered, during which German defenses might be strengthened, during which the window of opportunity might close forever like a door slamming shut in the wind. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, his face grave with the weight of sending thousands of airmen into the unknown darkness, spoke of cloud cover and visibility, of anti-aircraft fire and navigation hazards. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, whose ships would carry the assault force across waters that had known Viking longships and Spanish galleons, calculated wind speeds and wave heights like an ancient mariner reading the sea's moods. General Bernard Montgomery, the desert warrior who had chased Rommel across North Africa, studied the beach defenses with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a final gambit. But the decision, when it came, would rest with one man alone. Eisenhower, the son of a railroad worker who had never expected to command armies, who had spent his early career in peacetime posts far from glory, now held the fate of Western civilization in his weathered hands. The pressure was beyond imagining, beyond the experience of any human who had ever lived, for never before had so much depended on a single choice made by a single man in a single moment. The debate continued through the small hours of June 4th, voices rising and falling like waves against the shore. Some argued for delay, for waiting until conditions were perfect, until every variable favored the attackers. Others pushed for immediate action, arguing that delay meant discovery, that hesitation was the enemy of surprise, that the moment seized imperfectly was better than the perfect moment that never came. Outside, the storm raged as if nature itself was testing their resolve. Trees bent before the wind like supplicants before an altar, and the channel waters churned white with foam and fury. In the harbors and ports across southern England, 7,000 ships of every size and description rode at anchor, their crews listening to the wind and wondering if tomorrow would bring battle or another day of waiting. The paratroopers, already painted and equipped for battle, sat in their aircraft or lay on airfield cots, their thoughts turning inward like flowers closing at dusk. Some wrote final letters home, others cleaned weapons that already gleamed with perfection, and still others simply stared at the ceiling and thought of faces they might never see again. The weight of anticipation was almost physical, pressing down on them like the low clouds that scudded across the English sky. At 9:45 p.m. on June 4th, Eisenhower made his first crucial decision. The invasion scheduled for June 5th was definitively postponed. The storm was too fierce, the risks too great, the chances of success too slim. Word spread through the camps and bases like ripples across still water, bringing both relief and renewed tension, for everyone knew that the next decision would be final. The longest day began before dawn on June 5th in the pre-dawn darkness of the briefing room at Southwick House. The same men gathered around the same table, but the atmosphere had changed, charged now with the electricity of final decision. Group Captain Stagg entered with new weather reports, his face bearing news that would echo through history. The storm was weakening, the window was opening. June 6th offered a chance. The meteorological data painted a picture of marginal conditions, far from perfect but possibly acceptable. Winds would be strong but not impossible. Cloud cover would be partial, allowing some air support, and most crucially, the seas might be calm enough for the landing craft to make their perilous journey. It was not the weather they had hoped for, but it was weather they could work with, weather that offered hope wrapped in uncertainty. The debate was shorter this time, more focused, charged with the knowledge that this was the moment of ultimate decision. Every argument had been made, every variable considered, every risk weighed against the greater risk of continued delay. The moon would be right, the tide would be right, and if they waited for perfect weather, they might wait until the war was lost and the cause of freedom buried beneath the weight of indecision. At 4:15 a.m. on June 5th, with the rain still pattering against the windows and the wind still sighing through the trees, Eisenhower spoke the words that would launch the greatest military operation in human history. "Okay, we'll go," he said simply, his voice calm as still water, but carrying the weight of nations. 3 words that would send 150,000 men across the English Channel, that would begin the liberation of Europe, that would change the course of human history. The machinery of invasion, paused like a great clock waiting to strike, began to move again with the inexorable power of destiny itself. Orders flowed out from Portsmouth like rivers rushing to the sea, carrying the word to every ship, every airfield, every camp where young men waited for their appointment with history. The great wheel of Operation Overlord began to turn, and nothing now could stop it, not weather, not German defenses, not the fears that lived in every human heart. Across southern England, the word spread like dawn breaking over sleeping fields. Ship captains opened sealed orders that had waited weeks in safes, revealing for the first time their exact destinations on the Norman coast. Pilots received final briefings, their target maps marked with every flak tower and fighter base between England and France. Paratroopers gathered their gear with the careful precision of rituals performed before great undertakings. Each piece of equipment checked and rechecked with the devotion of prayer. The loading began immediately, a choreographed dance of men and machines and supplies that had been rehearsed countless times, but never felt so momentous. Soldiers filed aboard transport ships with their rifles and packs, their faces painted with camouflage and determination. Tanks and trucks drove up ramps and into the bellies of landing ships, their crews knowing that the next solid ground they touched would be the beaches of France. In the airfields of southern England, the great transport aircraft came alive with the roar of engines and the purposeful movement of men preparing for the most important mission of their lives. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, their faces streaked with war paint and their hearts heavy with responsibility, climbed aboard C-47 Dakotas that would carry them through darkness to drop zones behind enemy lines. Each man carried within him the hopes of a nation, the prayers of loved ones left behind, and the terrible weight of knowing that history would be written in the next few hours. The RAF and Royal Navy pilots ran through their final checks, their hands moving over instruments and controls with the fluid precision of musicians before a concert. They would provide cover for the invasion fleet, dueling with the Luftwaffe over the Channel waters, their Spitfires and Hurricanes writing victory or defeat in contrails against the cloudy sky. Some were veterans of the Battle of Britain who had saved their island home 4 years before. Now they would help save the world. As the day wore on, the great armada began to move, slowly at first, like a sleeping giant stirring to life. 7,000 ships of every conceivable type began their journey toward the assembly areas south of the Isle of Wight, their wakes cutting white furrows in the gray Channel waters. Battleships and cruisers, destroyers and minesweepers, transport ships and landing craft, all moving with the inexorable purpose of destiny itself. The sight from the air must have been breathtaking, this greatest gathering of ships in human history streaming across the waters like a migration of mechanical whales. From Portsmouth to Plymouth, from Weymouth to Dartmouth, the invasion fleet emerged from harbors that had sheltered Nelson's ships and Drake's privateers, carrying forward the long English tradition of facing the unknown across dangerous waters. As evening fell on June 5th, Eisenhower made one final gesture that revealed the humanity beneath the stars and responsibilities. He visited the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne at Greenham Common Airfield, walking among them in the gathering dusk, his presence a quiet benediction for men about to jump into the darkness above enemy territory. He spoke with them simply, without grand speeches or stirring rhetoric, just one American talking to others, sharing a moment of human connection before the inhuman demands of battle separated them forever. The paratroopers, their faces painted and their equipment checked one final time, seemed almost otherworldly in the twilight, like warriors from some ancient saga preparing for a battle that would determine the fate of kingdoms. They joked and laughed with the nervous energy of young men facing the unknown, but their eyes held the gravity of soldiers who understood that they carried the hopes of the free world in their parachute packs. As darkness fell over England on the evening of June 5th, 1944, the Great Armada continued its stately progress across the Channel waters. Behind them, the lights of England dimmed as blackout regulations took effect, but ahead lay the coast of France, wrapped in German defenses and the promise of liberation. The die was cast, the decision made, the great gamble begun. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany or one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. In his caravan at Portsmouth, Eisenhower sat alone with his thoughts and wrote out 2 messages on separate pieces of paper. One would announce the successful landing of Allied forces on the European continent, the beginning of the final drive toward Berlin and victory. The other, folded and placed in his wallet, took full responsibility for the failure of the invasion, should the beaches run red with Allied blood and the cause of freedom die in the Norman surf. The wind was beginning to calm, and through breaks in the clouds, stars appeared like beacons of hope in the darkening sky. Across the Channel, German sentries peered into the darkness, unaware that history was sailing toward them through the night, carried by the largest armada ever assembled and driven by the dreams of free peoples everywhere. The moment of decision was past. Now came the moment of action, the testing of courage and preparation, the transformation of plans into reality and hopes into history. The greatest gamble of the war was underway, and in a few short hours, the beaches of Normandy would witness either triumph or tragedy on a scale the world had never seen. In the deep darkness before dawn on June 6th, 1944, the sky above Normandy came alive with the drone of aircraft engines, a mechanical symphony that grew louder as hundreds of transport planes approached the sleeping French countryside. Inside these flying fortresses, young paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces painted with camouflage and their hearts painted with courage, preparing to leap from perfectly good airplanes into the greatest unknown of their lives. The lead aircraft carried pathfinders, elite soldiers whose job was to land first and mark the drop zones with lights and radio beacons, like lighthouse keepers, guiding ships through treacherous waters. These men, barely old enough to vote in most American states, carried upon their shoulders the weight of empires and the hopes of enslaved nations. They checked their equipment one final time in the red-lit cabin, their hands moving with the careful precision of priests preparing for Holy Communion. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 101st Airborne looked out through the small window of his C-47 Dakota and saw the French coast approaching like a dark promise on the horizon. Below, the German defenders slept in their bunkers and strongpoints, unaware that democracy itself was descending from the heavens on silk parachutes and aluminum wings. The anti-aircraft fire began to bloom in the darkness like deadly flowers, tracer rounds climbing toward the aircraft like angry meteors seeking vengeance against the stars. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop behind Utah Beach to secure causeways and bridges, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the coastal defenses. British and Canadian paratroopers would land near the Orne River to protect the eastern flank of the invasion, holding vital bridges like Horsa Bridge at Benneville until seaborne forces could relieve them. But plans, as every soldier knows, rarely survive contact with the enemy, and the darkness above Normandy was about to test human courage in ways no training could prepare them for. The German flak intensified as the transport aircraft crossed the coastline, turning the sky into a deadly constellation of bursting shells and tracers. Pilots gripped their controls tighter and flew on, their aircraft bucking and weaving through the defensive fire like ships in a storm. Some planes took hits, engines coughing and wings holed by shrapnel, but still they pressed on. Their crews, knowing that the young men in the cabin behind them depended on their skill and courage to deliver them safely to their date with destiny. Inside the aircraft, paratroopers felt their stomachs lurch as their planes twisted through the flak, the acrid smell of cordite and fear mixing with the aviation fuel and canvas scent that filled every military transport. Some men were sick, others prayed, and still others sat in perfect silence, their minds turned inward to that quiet place where courage lives and fear has no power. The red warning light came on, and every man checked his equipment one final time, knowing that in moments they would step out of the airplane and into history. The first Pathfinders jumped at 0:15 hours, disappearing into the darkness like shadows returning to shadow. Their job was to mark the drop zones with halophane lamps and Eureka radio beacons, creating islands of light in the sea of darkness that would guide the main assault waves to their targets. Many would miss their intended drop zones, scattered by winds and German fire, but they would adapt and improvise, For that was what paratroopers did. They made impossible situations merely difficult through sheer determination and training. Major John Howard of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry led 6 gliders in a precision landing beside Pegasus Bridge over the Caen Canal. The gliders, towed across the channel in darkness, were released over France to make silent approaches to their targets, their pilots guided only by maps memorized in the briefing rooms of England and the pale starlight filtering through broken clouds. The first glider, piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, touched down just yards from its target, a landing so precise it seemed like magic to those who witnessed it. The British paratroopers spilled from their gliders and rushed the bridge before the German guards could fully comprehend what was happening. In a brief, violent firefight that lasted only minutes but seemed like hours, they captured the vital crossing intact, the first piece of European soil to be liberated by the D-Day assault. They dug in among the poplars and waited for relief, knowing that they might have to hold this ground against counterattacks for hours or even days. Meanwhile, the American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were scattered across the Norman countryside like seeds scattered by a careless farmer. The combination of darkness, weather, and German flak had disrupted the neat drop patterns planned in England, but rather than disaster, this scattering created confusion in German ranks as reports of paratroopers came in from across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. Small groups of Americans, often mixed from different units, began forming ad hoc combat teams and moving toward their objectives with the improvised determination that would characterize the entire airborne effort. Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne found himself dangling from his parachute lines, caught on the church spire in St. Mère-Église, playing dead while German soldiers moved through the town square below him. For 2 hours he hung there, a witness to history from perhaps the most unusual vantage point of any soldier on D-Day, until American paratroopers fought their way into the town and cut him down. His story would become legend, but in that moment he was simply a young man from New York, trying to survive long enough to rejoin the fight. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole found himself in a Norman field with fewer than a dozen men from his original company, but he didn't hesitate. Using a child's toy cricket as a recognition signal in the darkness, he began gathering scattered paratroopers from any unit he could find, building a fighting force from the chaos of the drop. By dawn, he had assembled nearly 200 men and was moving toward his objective at Poopville, proving that leadership in combat is less about rank than about the will to act when action is needed most. The German response was initially confused and disjointed, which worked in the Allies' favor. Many German commanders believed the paratrooper drops were diversionary attacks designed to draw attention away from the main invasion, which they still expected at Calais. Others thought the scattered paratroopers were the result of navigation errors, crews lost in the darkness and dropping their loads wherever they could find open ground. The truth that this was the beginning of the long-awaited Second Front would dawn on them only gradually, like the sun rising over the Norman hedgerows. In the village of La Fière, a stone bridge over the Murderette River became the focus of some of the fiercest fighting of the airborne assault. American paratroopers, many from units that had never trained together, fought side by side against German counterattacks throughout the long day, their positions marked by the growing pile of empty brass casings and the acrid smell of gunpowder that mixed with the sweet scent of Norman apple blossoms. The British 6th Airborne Division, landing east of the Orne River, had specific objectives that would prove crucial to the success of the entire invasion. They needed to secure the bridges over the Orne and the Cane Canal, destroy the coastal battery at Merville, and establish a defensive line to protect the left flank of the seaborne assault. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway led 150 men against the Merville Battery, a fortress that intelligence reports suggested was defended by 200 Germans with 4 large-caliber guns capable of devastating the troops landing on Sword Beach. The assault on Merville began in darkness and confusion, as so many D-Day actions did. Otway's men had been scattered in the drop, their heavy weapons lost, their gliders carrying assault equipment shot down or landed miles from their target. But with the improvised courage that marked the airborne forces, they attacked with what they had: rifles, grenades, and the desperate knowledge that the men on the beaches depended on their success. The battery fell after a savage hand-to-hand fight in the pre-dawn darkness, its guns revealed to be smaller than intelligence had suggested, but still capable of wreaking havoc on the invasion fleet. The paratroopers destroyed the weapons and melted back into the Norman countryside, their mission accomplished despite impossible odds and equipment failures that would have stopped a less determined force. As the sun began to rise over Normandy on June 6th, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed incongruous with the violence unfolding below, the airborne forces had accomplished something remarkable. Scattered across dozens of miles of enemy territory, often isolated and outnumbered, they had seized key objectives, disrupted German communications, and created a screen of confusion that would prove invaluable to the seaborne assault now approaching the Norman beaches. But the cost had been significant. Many aircraft had been lost to German flak, their crews buried in Norman soil far from the homes they would never see again. Paratroopers lay scattered across fields and villages, some wounded, others captured, many simply missing in the chaos of night combat in unfamiliar territory. Yet, for every casualty, for every mission that went wrong, there was another small group of Allied soldiers holding a crossroads or a bridge, creating the conditions that would allow the great seaborne armada to establish its foothold on Hitler's fortress Europe. The airborne assault had been like throwing a handful of steel ball bearings into the gears of the German defensive machine. Individual bearings might be small and seemingly insignificant, but together they created friction, confusion, and delay at precisely the moment when speed and coordination were most crucial to the defense. The German reserves that should have been moving toward the beaches at first light were instead hunting paratroopers in the Bocage country, their attention divided and their response delayed by the very chaos that had seemed like failure to some of the scattered Allied soldiers. In a farmhouse near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a young American medic worked by candlelight to treat wounded paratroopers from 3 different units, their uniforms torn and muddy but their spirits unbroken. Outside, German patrols moved through the darkness, but inside, American and British soldiers shared cigarettes and quiet conversation, bound together by the brotherhood that comes only from facing death in the service of something greater than themselves. The French civilians, awakened by the sounds of battle and aircraft engines, peered from their windows to see parachutes hanging from trees like white flowers blooming in the darkness. Some hid in their cellars, terrified by the violence that had suddenly erupted in their peaceful countryside. Others, members of the resistance, or simply patriots who had waited 4 long years for this moment, emerged to help the Allied soldiers, offering food, directions, and the invaluable assistance of local knowledge. A Norman farmer named Pierre Folliot found 3 American paratroopers hiding in his barn at dawn, wounded and lost, but still carrying their weapons and their determination to reach their objective. Without hesitation, he shared his meager breakfast with them, guided them to the main road toward Carentan, and wished them luck in his careful English. Such small acts of courage, repeated hundreds of times across the drop zones, helped transform the airborne assault from potential disaster into qualified success. By full daylight, the scattered airborne forces were beginning to coalesce into effective fighting units. Small groups joining together, lost soldiers finding their way to rallying points, isolated strongholds being reinforced by stragglers who had been wandering the Norman countryside all night. The cricket toy that served as a recognition signal in the darkness had been replaced by passwords and careful recognition of uniforms and equipment, but the same spirit of improvised cooperation continued to characterize the airborne effort. Lieutenant Richard Winters of the 101st Airborne found himself leading a mixed group of paratroopers in an attack on a German artillery position at Brecourt Manor, guns that were firing on Omaha Beach and threatening the seaborne landings. With textbook small unit tactics learned at Fort Benning and refined in the hedgerows of Normandy, his men systematically destroyed the German position, capturing maps that revealed other artillery positions and contributing directly to the success of the beach assault. The British paratroopers holding Pegasus Bridge could hear the rumble of artillery from the direction of the beaches as the naval bombardment began in earnest, a sound that was both reassuring and ominous. They knew that their comrades were now fighting for footholds on the Norman sand, and that their job was to hold the bridges no matter what, to ensure that when relief came, it would find the vital crossings intact and in Allied hands. As the morning wore on, German resistance to the airborne forces became more organized and determined. The initial confusion was wearing off, and German commanders were beginning to understand the scope and purpose of the paratrooper drops. Counterattacks became more frequent and better coordinated, forcing the scattered Allied forces to fight not just for their objectives, but for their very survival in an increasingly hostile countryside. But the paratroopers held on, sustained by their training, their esprit de corps, and the knowledge that they were part of something larger than any individual battle or objective. They were the spear point of liberation, the advance guard of freedom, young men who had volunteered to jump from airplanes behind enemy lines because someone had to, and they had answered the call. In a field hospital set up in a Norman church, wounded paratroopers from both sides lay side by side while medics worked to save lives, regardless of the uniform worn by their patients. A young German soldier, barely old enough to shave, held the hand of an American paratrooper while both waited for treatment, their shared humanity transcending the artificial boundaries of nationality and ideology that had brought them to this moment. The success of the airborne assault would be measured not just in objectives seized or casualties inflicted, but in the cumulative effect of hundreds of small actions by small groups of determined soldiers. Every bridge held, every crossroads defended, every German unit delayed or confused contributed to creating the conditions that would allow the seaborne forces to establish their beachhead and begin the liberation of Western Europe. As noon approached on D-Day, the paratroopers could hear the sounds of battle from the direction of the beaches growing more intense, the rumble of artillery and the rattle of machine gun fire carrying across the Norman countryside like distant thunder. They had done their part in the great gamble, had jumped from the sky and seized their objectives against heavy odds, and now they waited for the connection with seaborne forces that would transform their isolated actions into part of a coordinated campaign. The airborne dawn was ending, but its effects would resonate throughout the long day ahead. The paratroopers had landed like seeds of liberation scattered across the Norman soil, and from each landing spot had grown a small but vital contribution to the greatest military operation in human history. They had been angels falling from heaven, armed with rifles and courage, carrying democracy on silk wings into the heart of occupied Europe. In the grey pre-dawn hours of June 6th, 1944, as the paratroopers fought their scattered battles in the Norman countryside, the greatest armada in human history approached the coast of France, through choppy channel waters that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. 7,000 ships of every conceivable size and purpose rode the swells like a vast mechanical migration, their hulls cutting white wakes in the dark water as they carried the hopes of the free world toward 5 beaches that would soon become the most famous shores on Earth. The massive naval bombardment began at 5:50 a.m., turning the dawn sky into an artificial aurora of muzzle flashes and exploding shells. Battleships that had sailed these same waters decades earlier, their guns now trained on concrete bunkers instead of enemy fleets, opened fire with a sound like thunder rolling across the face of the deep. The USS Texas and USS Arkansas, veterans of the Great War, joined their British counterparts, HMS Warspite and HMS Ramillies, in hurling tons of high explosive at the German Atlantic Wall, their shells screaming overhead like the wrath of democracy itself made manifest in steel and fire. From the landing craft approaching Omaha Beach, the young soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions watched the bombardment with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The shells from the big naval guns passed overhead, with sounds like freight trains rushing through the sky, and where they struck the Norman cliffs, great geysers of earth and concrete erupted skyward like volcanic explosions. Surely, the soldiers thought, nothing could survive such devastation. Surely the German defenders would be stunned into submission by such overwhelming firepower. But the Atlantic Wall had been designed by some of the finest military engineers in the world, men who understood that concrete could absorb punishment that would destroy lesser fortifications. Many of the German bunkers and gun positions, built deep into the cliffs and protected by meters of reinforced concrete, survived the bombardment intact, their occupants shaken but undefeated, waiting for the moment when the naval guns would lift their fire and the landing craft would come within range of machine guns and mortars. At Utah Beach, the westernmost of the 5 landing zones, the 4th Infantry Division prepared for what they hoped would be the easiest of the D-Day landings. The beach was lightly defended compared to Omaha, and the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were already operating behind the coastal defenses, disrupting German communications and preventing the movement of reserves. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and the oldest man to land on D-Day, insisted on going ashore with the first wave, his presence a testament to the importance of leadership by example. The landing craft carrying the assault troops were marvels of wartime engineering, humble vessels designed for one purpose: to carry soldiers from ship to shore across hostile waters and deliver them as close to dry land as possible. The LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, known to every soldier as the Higgins boat after its designer Andrew Higgins, had a front ramp that would drop to allow rapid deployment of troops. But first, these small craft had to navigate through German obstacles underwater mines, and defensive fire that would turn the surf red with blood. The German defenders, commanded by experienced officers who had fought on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, watched the approaching armada with professional appreciation for its size and coordination. From concrete bunkers and steel-reinforced positions, they prepared to execute defensive plans that had been rehearsed countless times over the past months. Machine gunners checked their ammunition belts one final time, mortar crews adjusted their range cards, and artillery observers prepared to call down fire on predetermined killing zones that had been surveyed with Teutonic precision. At Omaha Beach, the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced the most formidable defenses on the entire Norman coast. The beach was overlooked by high bluffs, honeycombed with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and artillery observation posts that commanded perfect fields of fire across the sand. The German 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran unit that intelligence had not detected in the area, waited in positions that had been designed specifically to turn the beach into a killing ground. As the landing craft approached the shore, seasick soldiers who had been vomiting into their helmets for hours tried to prepare themselves mentally for what they knew would be the longest walk of their lives. The distance from the water's edge to the seawall across open sand, swept by interlocking machine gun fire. Many had written final letters to wives and mothers, sealed them in waterproof pouches, and pinned them inside their field jackets. Others fingered religious medals or looked at photographs that they might never see again. The first landing craft touched down at 6:30 a.m., their ramps dropping to reveal not the stunned and demoralized defenders that had been hoped for, but alert German soldiers who had weathered the bombardment and were ready to defend their positions with the desperation of men fighting for their homeland. The machine guns opened fire immediately, their tracers lacing across the beach like deadly spider webs, and the water turned red as soldiers fell before they could take more than a few steps onto French soil. At Omaha Beach Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, men mostly from the small towns and farms of Virginia suffered devastating casualties in the first few minutes of the landing. Of the 32 men in the first boat to reach shore, only 6 survived the initial minutes of combat. The beach became a scene from Dante's Inferno, littered with equipment, wounded men, and the bodies of soldiers who had traveled thousands of miles to die within sight of freedom. But even in the midst of such horror, individual acts of courage began to turn the tide of battle. Sergeant First Class Charles Shea, a Penobscot Indian from Maine, repeatedly braved German fire to drag wounded soldiers from the water's edge to whatever cover could be found behind beach obstacles and the bodies of knocked-out vehicles. His actions, multiplied by hundreds of similar acts of selfless bravery, gradually began to create pockets of survival and resistance on what had seemed to be a beach of death. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment, seeing his men pinned down by devastating fire, rallied them with words that would echo through military history. Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. His message was clear. The only way off the beach was forward, through the German defenses, and every minute spent cowering in whatever shelter they could find only made the situation worse. The breakthrough at Omaha came not from any grand strategic plan, but from small groups of soldiers who decided that dying while moving forward was preferable to dying while lying still. Rangers from the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, trained for precisely this kind of desperate assault, began working their way up the bluffs using grappling hooks, rope ladders, and sheer determination. Behind them, regular infantry followed, clawing their way up paths that were swept by German fire, but offered the only route off the deadly beach. At Utah Beach, the situation was dramatically different. The landing craft had been carried by strong currents to a section of beach nearly a mile south of their intended target, but this accident turned out to be a stroke of fortune. The defenses in the actual landing zone were lighter than expected, and Brigadier General Roosevelt, finding himself in the wrong place but with enemy resistance that was manageable, made the famous decision, "We'll start the war from right here." The success at Utah Beach was aided immeasurably by the airborne forces operating inland. The paratroopers had secured the causeways leading from the beach, preventing German reserves from moving up to reinforce the coastal defenses. By mid-morning, the 4th Infantry Division was pushing inland with relatively light casualties, linking up with scattered groups of paratroopers and establishing a secure beachhead that would serve as a foundation for future operations. Gold Beach, assigned to the British 50th Infantry Division, witnessed a more methodical but equally determined assault. British soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Italy, approached their task with the professional competence that came from years of combat experience. The specialized armor that supported their landing tanks that could swim ashore, others that could clear minefields or flame enemy bunkers, proved invaluable in overcoming German resistance. The British assault was characterized by careful coordination between infantry, armor, and supporting arms, a lesson learned through bitter experience in earlier campaigns. Tank crews worked closely with infantry squads, engineers cleared paths through minefields and obstacles, and artillery observers called down fire from naval guns with precision that gradually wore down German resistance. By noon, the British were pushing inland toward their first-day objective of Bayou, their advance steady if not spectacular. Juno Beach saw the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division come ashore with a determination that surprised even veteran German defenders. The Canadians had trained for this moment for years, and their assault combined the tactical lessons learned by their British allies with a particularly Canadian brand of aggressive determination. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada and the North Shore Regiment fought their way off the beach with casualties that were heavy but not catastrophic, establishing a beachhead that would hold against all German counterattacks. At Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division faced the additional challenge of linking up with the airborne forces holding the bridges over the Orne River. Their advance inland was delayed by stronger than expected German resistance, particularly around the seaside resort of Ouistreham, where German Marines fought with the desperation of elite troops defending their homeland. The connection with the paratroopers would not be made until late in the day, but when it came, it secured the eastern flank of the entire invasion. The German response to the landings was hampered by confusion at the highest levels of command. Many senior officers still believed that the Normandy landings were a diversion designed to draw attention away from the main assault, which would surely come at Calais. The reserve panzer divisions that might have crushed the Allied beachheads remained uncommitted, waiting for orders from Hitler himself, who was asleep in his Bavarian retreat and had left instructions not to be awakened. But at the tactical level, German resistance was fierce and professional. Individual strongpoints held out against overwhelming odds, their defenders fighting with the courage of soldiers who knew that every hour they held might bring reinforcements and a chance to throw the invaders back into the sea. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red hot. Mortar crews dropped shells on target even as Allied forces closed in on their positions, and snipers picked off Allied officers with deadly precision. The naval gunfire support proved crucial throughout the day, as observers ashore called down fire on German positions that were holding up the advance. The big guns of the battleships and cruisers could reach targets miles inland, their shells guided by forward observers who risked their lives to get close enough to German positions to provide accurate targeting information. The psychological effect of naval gunfire on German defenders was almost as important as its physical destruction, the sound of incoming shells serving as a constant reminder that the Allies commanded overwhelming firepower. As the day wore on, the character of the fighting began to change from an assault from the sea to a battle for control of the Norman countryside. Allied forces pushed inland from their beachheads, encountering the bocage country that would characterize much of the Normandy campaign. Small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows that provided perfect defensive positions for determined soldiers. Every field became a potential battlefield, every hedgerow a potential fortress that would have to be taken by storm. The buildup of supplies and reinforcements across the beaches proceeded throughout the day, a logistical miracle that transformed the Norman shores from battlefields into the busiest ports in the world. LSTs, landing ship, tank, beached themselves to disgorge tanks and trucks directly onto the sand, while smaller craft shuttled supplies from ships anchored offshore. Military police directed traffic, engineers built temporary roads, and medical personnel established aid stations and evacuation points for the growing number of casualties. By evening on June 6th, the Allies had achieved what many had thought impossible. They had stormed the most heavily defended coastline in the world and established 5 separate beachheads that could be supplied and reinforced. The cost had been significant, over 10,000 casualties across all 5 beaches, but it was far less than the catastrophic losses that some planners had feared. More importantly, the Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's fortress Europe had been penetrated, and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. The thunder from the sea had announced a new chapter in human history, written in courage and sacrifice on the beaches of Normandy. Young men from democratic nations had proven that free peoples, properly led and equipped, could overcome any obstacle when fighting for the cause of human liberty. The longest day was far from over, but already its outcome was clear. The Allies were assured to stay, and the road to Berlin lay open before them. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy bore little resemblance to the peaceful Norman shores that had greeted the dawn. Where fishing boats had once pulled nets full of silver fish onto quiet sand, now landing craft disgorged endless streams of men and machines, transforming 5 separate stretches of coastline into the busiest ports on Earth. The thunder of artillery had replaced the cry of seabirds, and the Norman surf ran red with the blood of heroes who had crossed an ocean to free a continent. At Omaha Beach, where the morning had brought scenes from the darkest circles of Dante's hell, American soldiers now moved with the methodical purpose of men who had looked death in the face and found they could live with what they saw there. The bluffs that had seemed insurmountable in the dawn light now bristled with Allied positions, machine gun nests turned around to face inland, mortar crews digging in to support the advance toward the first day's objectives. The beach itself, littered with the detritus of battle-abandoned equipment, empty ammunition boxes, and the crosses that marked graves in the sand, served as a grim reminder of the price that had been paid for this foothold on European soil. Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment, wounded twice but still leading his men, established his command post in a crater blown in the sand by German mortar fire. Around him, runners carried messages to companies scattered across the Norman countryside, their reports painting a picture of small unit actions, isolated firefights, and the gradual expansion of the American beachhead. One hedgerow, one farmhouse, one crossroads at a time. The grand strategy conceived in London and Washington was being executed by sergeants and lieutenants who improvised solutions to problems that no staff college had ever contemplated. The German response, initially confused and uncoordinated, was beginning to develop a coherence that worried Allied commanders. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored reserve close enough to influence the battle, had finally received orders to attack and was moving towards the gap between Juno and Sword Beaches, where Canadian and British forces had not yet linked up. German tanks, their steel sides painted with camouflage that made them nearly invisible in the bocage country, moved carefully through lanes that their crews had reconnoitered for months in preparation for exactly this moment. But the panzers arrived piecemeal, without proper infantry support, and found themselves facing not just Allied ground forces, but the concentrated fire of naval guns that could reach far inland. British artillery observers, linked by radio to cruisers and destroyers offshore, called down devastating fire on German armor whenever it appeared in the open. The German counterattack, which might have succeeded if launched at dawn against scattered and disorganized Allied forces, instead found itself hitting a beachhead that was growing stronger by the hour. At Pointe du Hoc, the rangers who had scaled the cliffs at such terrible cost discovered that the massive guns they had come to destroy were wooden decoys, the real weapons having been moved inland weeks earlier. But rather than disappointment, this discovery brought a grim satisfaction. Their courage and sacrifice had not been wasted, for the real guns were found abandoned in an orchard a mile inland, their crews having fled before the approaching Rangers could destroy them. The mission was complete, though not in the way anyone had planned, proving once again that in war, success often comes disguised as failure. The link-up between the airborne forces and the seaborne assault proceeded throughout the afternoon. Small groups of paratroopers emerging from the Norman countryside to make contact with advancing infantry. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, who had spent the night gathering scattered paratroopers in the darkness, finally made contact with elements of the 4th Infantry Division advancing from Utah Beach. The handshake between an airborne officer and a beach infantry commander marked more than just tactical success. It represented the fusion of two separate operations into a single, coordinated campaign. The French civilians, caught in the middle of the greatest battle their homeland had ever witnessed, reacted with a mixture of terror, hope, and quiet heroism. In Sainte-Mère-Église, now firmly in American hands, townspeople emerged from their cellars to offer water and food to soldiers who looked impossibly young to be carrying such terrible responsibilities. A Norman baker, his ovens cold since the bombardment began, shared his remaining bread with wounded paratroopers, his simple act of hospitality, a reminder that humanity persists even in the midst of the most inhuman circumstances. The casualties from D-Day began arriving at field hospitals established in Norman churches and schoolhouses, their wounds telling the story of the day's battles in blood and pain. American, British, Canadian, and German wounded lay side by side on stretchers, tended by medical personnel who recognized no nationality when it came to suffering. A young German soldier, barely old enough to shave, held the hand of an American GI while both waited for surgery, their shared humanity transcending the artificial boundaries that had brought them to this moment of mutual vulnerability. The logistical miracle of D-Day was perhaps most evident as the sun began to set over the Norman coast. Where the morning had brought only landing craft filled with assault troops, the afternoon witnessed an endless parade of supply vessels, ammunition ships, fuel tankers, and hospital ships that would sustain the growing Allied presence in France. Engineers worked to clear obstacles from the beaches, build temporary piers, and establish supply dumps that would feed the appetite of modern mechanized armies for fuel, ammunition, and equipment. The air battle over Normandy, largely invisible to the soldiers fighting on the ground, had been won decisively by the Allied air forces. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, managed only token resistance against the massive Allied air armada. P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires patrolled the skies over the beachheads, their presence a reassuring reminder to ground forces that they would not face the dive-bombing attacks that had characterized earlier German victories in Poland, France, and Russia. As darkness approached, the character of the battle began to change from amphibious assault to conventional land warfare. Allied forces, no longer dependent on landing craft for supplies, began to push inland with the confidence that comes from secure lines of communication and overwhelming material superiority. The bocage country of Normandy, with its small fields and thick hedgerows, would prove to be ideal defensive terrain. But the Allies now had the initiative and the resources to wage a sustained campaign against German defenses. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces, established his headquarters ashore as the sun set on D-Day, symbolically demonstrating that the Allied commitment to the European mainland was permanent. His presence on Norman soil, along with that of his British and Canadian counterparts, sent a clear message to both Allied soldiers and German defenders. This was not a raid to be repelled, but the beginning of a campaign that would end only with the complete liberation of Western Europe. The German High Command, finally beginning to grasp the scope of the Allied operation, faced the reality that their much-vaunted Atlantic Wall had been breached in 5 separate places by forces that showed no intention of being dislodged. Field Marshal Rommel, rushing back from Germany where he had gone to celebrate his wife's birthday, surveyed the situation with the professional eye of a soldier who understood that the decisive battle of the war in the West had begun. But the mobile reserves that might have contained the Allied beachheads had been held too far inland, victims of a strategic paralysis that had gripped the German command structure. The French resistance, emboldened by the success of the Allied landings, began to emerge from 4 years of underground warfare to openly support the liberation effort. Sabotage of railway lines, attacks on German supply convoys, and intelligence gathering increased dramatically as resistance fighters realized that the moment they had waited for had finally arrived. Their activities, coordinated through coded messages broadcast by the BBC, created additional chaos behind German lines and prevented the rapid movement of reserves toward the beachheads. In Washington and London, government leaders who had spent months agonizing over the decision to launch Operation Overlord received the first detailed reports of D-Day's success, with emotions that ranged from relief to exhilaration. Churchill, who had lived through the dark days of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, understood that June 6th marked the beginning of the end of Hitler's empire. Roosevelt, confined to a wheelchair but possessing a will of iron, knew that American boys had proven themselves worthy heirs to the men who had fought at Lexington and Gettysburg. But perhaps the most significant moment of D-Day's end came not in any headquarters or government office, but in the quiet conversations between soldiers who had survived the longest day and were beginning to understand what they had accomplished. A sergeant from Iowa, his rifle cradled in his arms and his uniform torn by German shrapnel, looked out over the Norman countryside and realized that he was standing on free French soil for the first time since 1940. The weight of that moment, the understanding that democracy had returned to Western Europe on the shoulders of farm boys and factory workers from across the Atlantic, was almost too much to bear. The wounded and the dying of D-Day, both Allied and German, bore witness to courage that transcended nationality and ideology. In aid stations and field hospitals, young men who had tried to kill each other hours before shared cigarettes and water, their common humanity revealed by suffering that made enemies into fellow travelers on the hardest road any generation has ever walked. The brotherhood of combat, that mystical bond that unites men who have faced death together, extended even to former enemies when the fighting stopped and the healing began. As midnight approached on June 6th, 1944, the Allied beachheads in Normandy held over 150,000 soldiers, a number that would double within a week and grow exponentially in the weeks that followed. The greatest amphibious operation in human history had succeeded, not through perfect planning or flawless execution, but through the accumulated courage of ordinary men doing extraordinary things when history demanded it of them. From the paratroopers who had jumped into darkness to the rangers who had climbed impossible cliffs, from the infantrymen who had walked across beaches swept by machine gun fire to the sailors who had brought them safely across the channel, each had contributed to a victory that belonged to all. The Atlantic Wall, that symbol of Nazi invincibility, lay in ruins along the Norman coast. Concrete bunkers that had seemed impregnable at dawn were now silent monuments to the power of free men fighting for a just cause. The beach obstacles that had been designed to tear the hulls from landing craft now served as anchoring points for Allied supply operations. their twisted steel transformed from instruments of defense into tools of liberation. The cost of victory had been significant, but not catastrophic. Approximately 10,000 Allied casualties across all 5 beaches, far fewer than the 20,000 that some pessimistic planners had feared. Each casualty represented a family that would receive a telegram, a community that would mourn, a future that would never be realized. But their sacrifice had not been in vain, for they had purchased with their blood a foothold on the European continent that would never be relinquished, a beachhead from which the forces of freedom would advance inexorably toward Berlin and final victory. The German casualties, though lighter in absolute numbers, were perhaps more significant in their strategic impact. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had fought so fiercely at Omaha Beach, was essentially destroyed as an effective fighting force. Coastal defense units that had spent months preparing positions were scattered or captured, their local knowledge and defensive preparations lost forever. Most importantly, the myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated through years of lightning victories, lay shattered in the Norman sand alongside the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall. In the gathering darkness, Allied soldiers began the process of consolidating their gains and preparing for the battles that would surely come with the dawn. Foxholes were dug in Norman soil that many of them would never leave. Machine gun positions were established to cover the most likely approaches for German counterattacks, and ammunition was distributed to men who had learned in a single day how quickly supplies could be exhausted in modern combat. The routine of soldiering, interrupted by the chaos of amphibious assault, resumed its ancient rhythm of dig, clean weapons, eat if possible, and try to get some sleep before the next crisis demanded their attention. The naval forces, having completed their primary mission of delivering the assault forces safely to enemy shores, began the equally important task of maintaining the sea lanes that would sustain the growing Allied presence in France. Destroyers and cruisers established patrol patterns to protect the anchorages from German submarines and motor torpedo boats, while minesweepers worked through the night to clear channels that would allow larger supply ships to reach the beaches safely. The Battle of the Atlantic, fought over 3 years of convoy warfare, had culminated in this moment when the sea lanes became highways of liberation rather than hunting grounds for U-boats. The airfields of southern England, which had launched the greatest air armada in history 12 hours earlier, began receiving the first returning aircraft as crews completed their missions over Normandy. Fighter pilots, their faces marked with fatigue and the pale lines where oxygen masks had pressed against their skin, climbed down from cockpits, still warm from combat, and reported the complete absence of Luftwaffe resistance. Bomber crews, returning from missions against German reserves and supply lines, spoke of secondary explosions and burning vehicles, evidence that their efforts were preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beachheads. The intelligence networks that had made D-Day possible continued their work throughout the night, intercepting German radio traffic that revealed confusion and indecision in the enemy command structure. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working under conditions of secrecy that would not be revealed for decades, provided Allied commanders with insights into German intentions and capabilities that proved invaluable in the critical hours following the initial landings. The war of information, fought by mathematicians and linguists rather than soldiers, had proven as decisive as any battle fought with bullets and shells. The medical services, overwhelmed by the casualties of D-Day but not defeated by them, worked through the night to save lives and ease suffering. Field hospitals, established in Norman churches and schoolhouses, became islands of healing in a landscape of destruction, staffed by doctors and nurses who had volunteered to share the dangers faced by combat soldiers. Blood, plasma, penicillin, and morphine, the trinity of modern battlefield medicine, saved lives that would have been lost in earlier wars, while surgical techniques learned in North Africa and Italy were refined under the pressure of mass casualties. The logistics officers, perhaps the most unsung heroes of D-Day, worked to establish the supply systems that would transform temporary beachheads into permanent bases for offensive operations. Fuel had to be brought ashore for thousands of vehicles, ammunition for weapons that consumed bullets and shells at rates that peacetime planners had never imagined, food for armies that had grown far beyond anything in previous military history. The mathematics of modern warfare, so many gallons of fuel per mile, so many rounds of ammunition per enemy soldier killed, so many calories per man per day, became the foundation upon which strategic success would be built. The French population, liberated but not yet fully comprehending the magnitude of what had occurred, began the difficult process of adjusting to freedom after 4 years of occupation. Children who had learned to fear the sound of aircraft engines because they might bring bombing raids now watched Allied planes overhead with wonder and joy. Adults who had whispered anti-German sentiments in cellars and back rooms could now speak openly of their hopes for the future, their voices carrying the tentative joy of people who had not dared to dream that this day would ever come. The collaboration between Allied forces and the French resistance, planned in London and executed in Norman villages, proved that the bonds between free peoples transcended nationality and language. French guides led American paratroopers through countryside they had known since childhood, their knowledge of every path and shortcut proving invaluable to soldiers operating in unfamiliar territory. British commandos worked alongside resistance fighters who had been preparing for this moment since the dark days of 1940, their cooperation a testament to the international character of the struggle against fascism. As the night deepened and the sounds of battle gradually faded into the distance, replaced by the more routine noises of armies establishing themselves in hostile territory, the full magnitude of what had been accomplished began to emerge. The longest day was ending, but its legacy would endure for generations. Democracy had proven that it could mobilize resources and inspire sacrifice on a scale that totalitarian regimes, for all their apparent efficiency, could not match. Free peoples, fighting for principles larger than themselves, had overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable and achieved victory that had seemed impossible. The stars that appeared in the Norman sky as the clouds of war temporarily parted shone down on a continent where freedom had returned after 4 years of darkness. American soldiers from farms in Kansas and factories in Detroit lay sleeping in foxholes dug in French soil. Their presence, a promise that the cause of human liberty would never again be abandoned to fight alone against the forces of oppression. British and Canadian forces, drawing on reserves of courage that had sustained them through the darkest hours of the war, prepared for battles that would lead eventually to the liberation of their European allies and the restoration of the balance that had been shattered in 1939. The German soldiers who had survived the longest day faced a future that held little hope of ultimate victory. Many were young men who had been told that they were defending European civilization against barbarous invaders, only to discover that their enemies treated prisoners with dignity and wounded with compassion. The propaganda that had sustained them through years of war was crumbling under the weight of reality, leaving them to fight on from habit and discipline rather than conviction. The tide of history, which had seemed to favor the forces of darkness for so many years, had finally turned with the rising sun over Normandy on June 6, 1944. The Axis powers, which had conquered most of Europe and threatened to extinguish the flame of human freedom, now faced enemies on multiple fronts, the Soviets advancing from the east, the Allies established in the west, and resistance movements throughout occupied Europe, emboldened by the success of D-Day. The ring was closing around Nazi Germany, and every day would bring the forces of liberation closer to final victory. The longest day was ending, but its consequences would echo through history for generations to come. Children not yet born would grow up in a world where democracy had proven its worth in the ultimate test, where free nations had demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice everything for the principles they held dear. The beaches of Normandy would be remembered not as sites of slaughter, but as birthplaces of liberation, where ordinary men had accomplished extraordinary things because the cause demanded it of them. As midnight approached on June 6, 1944, bringing an end to the longest day in military history, the Allied forces in Normandy could rest with the satisfaction of duty well done and objectives achieved against overwhelming odds. They had crossed the English Channel in the greatest armada ever assembled, stormed the most heavily defended coastline in the world, and established beachheads that would serve as springboards for the liberation of Western Europe. The cost had been high, but the victory was complete and final. Hitler's fortress Europe had been breached, and the road to Berlin lay open before the armies of freedom. The greatest landing in history was complete. Democracy had returned to continental Europe, carried on the shoulders of young men who had proven themselves worthy heirs to the generations that had fought at Lexington and Concord, at Waterloo and Gettysburg, in all the great struggles that had defined the long march of human freedom. They had answered history's call, and history would remember them as the generation that saved the world from darkness and restored the light of human dignity to a continent that had almost lost hope. The longest day was ending, but the dawn of liberation had just begun. In the years to come, these same soldiers would fight through the hedgerows of Normandy, the streets of Paris, the forests of the Ardennes, and finally to the gates of Berlin itself. But they would always remember June 6th, 1944, as the day when everything changed, when the tide of war turned decisively in favor of freedom, and when ordinary men accomplished the extraordinary by refusing to accept that evil could triumph over good. Sleep now, dear listener, and dream of heroes. Dream of paratroopers falling like stars from heaven, of sailors navigating treacherous waters to deliver democracy to distant shores, of soldiers walking across beaches swept by machine gun fire because someone had to and they had answered the call. Dream of the longest day when freedom returned to Europe on the wings of courage and the shoulders of young men who understood that some things are worth dying for. The greatest landing in history is complete. The heroes have earned their rest, and so have you. Good night.